Well, and I'm sorry to keep doing this, but there is an issue with this continual message that I get last minute saying YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. Well, I'm just going to have to keep going. So, welcome everyone to the Camden Haven Anglican Church drill down. Let me just adjust something there. There we go. Tonight we are thinking about Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 to 12, and that is on the issue of divorce. And so it's a passage that includes divorce, although it's not the Bible's full teaching on divorce. But because it raises this issue, I feel like we need to address it as best we can in the time that we've got. So I'm not sure. I'm just going to check on my phone that people are seeing what I'm seeing, because what I'm seeing, it looks very different. And here we go. Let's just check that and go here. Okay. Well, here we go. Something's happening. That's good. If you happen to have experienced divorce, or you are in a difficult marriage, or if any of this raises issues for you as we talk through this, I'm really happy to make time to have a chat if that's helpful. Or can I encourage you to find someone to have a chat with, or it's okay to turn it off and to go and watch something else. So that might be worthwhile doing, and that's okay if you're not feeling well about this. But what we're going to do is we're going to dive into it, because we've got lots to talk about, and we're going to do our normal thing and see this. Well, yes, thank you to Penny, who's giving me a bit of a idea. She said, it's been telling you that every week, but it doesn't seem to matter. Yes, don't listen to YouTube. We're going to dive into this. We've got lots of things to talk about, lots of things to think through. If you have a question, then please put it in the live chat, and I will attempt to make sure I notice it and be able to get to it. So let's just pop that on and that on there. And let's dive in. I got so much to say. I'm not going to have time to say it, but we're going to have fun in the meantime. Let me check my pen is working. It is. There it is. So I'll just rub that out. Okay. So I'm going to make it a bit smaller because it is a bit thick. There we go. We'll just go down a bit to about there. Okay. That's better. Okay, so first of all, you know what we do with these titles is we scribble them out, because although this does have the matter of divorce raised, if you see that title, you will think this is all that the Bible has to say, and when you come to your conclusion, you'll be mistaken. We need to just realise this is a little bit of what the Bible has to say about a particular type of divorce, but we'll see that in a minute. Now, as you can see here, I'm going to change that to that one. When Jesus had finished these sayings, and the sayings were just what precedes, and those were the stories, the issue of how many times should I forgive my brother or sister when they sin against me, and other bits and pieces like that. He went away from Galilee, so we know he's going away from Galilee, and he entered the region of Judea beyond the what? The Jordan. Now, we need to remember that the first century writers didn't have endless bits of paper and computers to delete what they've just written and rewrite again. No, they they had to really think very hard about what they wrote because they had limited resources like limited paper and limited ink, all those sorts of things. They really had to make their words count. And so when we see something, what that makes us say is that, this is really important, whatever words we see, because every word has been intended and put there. And so here we've got a geographical reference, and this geographical reference is significantly at the Jordan River, on the other side of beyond the Jordan there. And when we think back in Matthew's Gospel, we ask the question, what is the significance of the Jordan? And when we go back, we find out, that is the region of John the Baptist. It's not only the region of John the Baptist, though. It is also the region of those who put John the Baptist to death. So you think back to Matthew chapter 14, you'll find the story of Herodias and Herod Antipas. And it's a pretty horrible story because Herodias gets her daughter Salome, they say, to dance, and it sounds like a very erotic dance, which excites, to put it lightly, to Herod, and Herod makes this big offer, and then of half the kingdom, and then Herodias, Salome goes back to Herodias and says, "What should I ask for?" And now Herodias really wants John the Baptist dead. Why? Wants John the Baptist dead because he said that their marriage was not valid, that according to the Old Testament, their marriage was not lawful. It was adultery. And this is a difficult and embarrassing thing for a prominent person to be calling out another prominent person. John the Baptist was prominent in one way. He's not rich prominent, but he was outspoken. That might be a better word than prominent. He was outspoken, and in his outspokenness spoke against the ruling party at the time, Herod and Herodias. So Herodias was bitter against him, really wanted him dead. Herod was more fascinated by John the Baptist, but Herodias asked for John the Baptist's head. Herod had to pay up because he was concerned about what people thought of him. And then he served up the head of John the Baptist to the daughter of his wife. Well, I mean, very gruesome, very, very gruesome on a number of levels. But that's the region that Jesus is in. Jesus is in the region run by a couple who have a famous divorce and a famous remarriage. And there's a famous outspoken person, John the Baptist, who has been speaking about the validity or the non-validity of their marriage. Now you are going to expect this question. This is not a random question on divorce. This is a question that makes sense given this geographical spot that he's in. And so they asked the question. Here it is. And the Pharisees came up not just to ask him his opinion, but to test him. They tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any and every cause? Now, what we do when we read this is we miss this bit. For any and every cause. And that's unfortunate because that's the most important bit. The Pharisees were Bible guys, and they knew that it was lawful to divorce. The Old Testament said divorce is not okay, but it's okay. And divorce was not the intention of marriage. The intention of marriage was lifelong, faithful, etc., that sort of thing. You know all about that because we've inherited it in our Western world, and most of the world has inherited it, in fact. And so the Pharisees knew that divorce was okay. There was divorce okay for a number of reasons in the Old Testament. One of them, obviously, was sexual immorality. But if you were to look at, say, famously, Exodus 21, it talks about a number of different reasons that a wife could be sent away or leave, that sort of thing. And as I said, one of those is immorality, but the others are not providing shelter, not providing food, and not providing care. So already in the Old Testament, there are at least 4 reasons to be divorced. There weren't 4 reasons that you had to be divorced, but 4 reasons that you could be divorced. And this question here of, so that question, is it lawful to divorce? The answer was clearly yes. The question is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause or for any and every reason? Now, in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, there is some law about divorce. And in that law is the reasons that one may or may not get divorced. And I don't know, let's have a look if I put it here. Let's find it, because it would be good to read it. 24, there it is. And how do I get rid of that? I don't know how to get rid of that. There we go. So here we have, let's highlight that, choose that colour. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if she finds no favour in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his home. So it does go on, but what we see here is what must happen when there is a divorce. And there were 2 schools of thought that analysed this verse, trying to work out what the grounds of divorce were. The grounds, I should say, of valid divorce. And so here, if she finds no favour in his eyes, which is also if he doesn't favour her for some reason, because he has found some indecency, which I understand is literally the nakedness of a thing. That it's a strange term, and that's why there was debate about it. There was 2 schools of debate: the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And Hillel was liberal, if you can try to put it that way, liberal Hillel. And what he said was the some indecency or the nakedness of a thing was 2 ideas. One, nakedness, was sort of exposure, which is sort of the whole idea of indecency or immorality. But the nakedness of a thing, the of a thing bit, he said was another bit, another reason. So you could divorce your wife because of adultery or immorality, this nakedness, or anything, another thing, whatever thing comes along. So that was why it was famous for husbands to divorce their wives for a thing, which could have been something like burning the dinner is a classic one. Just being boring, or all sorts of ideas. The husband could have said, this means I can divorce. The other school was the school of Shammai, and Shammai was a more strict, I think Shammai strict, and he said, no, that's not 2 things, nakedness of a thing, but it is one thing, and that is just immorality. So immorality, certainly they agree with. Of course, immorality is valid, but the rest of the things were debatable. And in this passage, as we go back to it, the question that the Pharisees are asking Jesus is, which side are you on? Are you on the side of Shammai, or are you on the side of Hillel? Are you on the side of strictness, or are you on the side of liberalness? And this was, as it says here, a test. Now, we don't really know the nature of the test, but we can surmise and say that it was probably something like, so the Pharisees are against Jesus. They want to get rid of him. So somehow this test has got to put Jesus in an awkward predicament. And I suppose the only awkward predicament I can think of is if Jesus lands on either side, he will either alienate himself from his disciples, who are very keen and zealous for the law, because if he falls on the side of Hillel, then he will say, he'll be saying, oh, he's very liberal and doesn't really take the law very seriously. But if he falls on the side of the more strict, then he's going to find himself at opposition with Herod and Herodias, the leaders of that area. And the leaders of that area are not like the leaders of today. They can take you out, they can chop your head off, that sort of thing. So that would have been certain danger. So he has to make a call here, and either way the Pharisees win, don't they? Because he either alienates his disciples or gets in trouble with the law. A win-win for them. So what he says to them is, I'm not going to answer your question in the way that you want me to answer it. And he goes on to say, he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. I'll talk to you a moment on why I highlighted those words two times. Jesus replies with the intention of marriage. And he says this marriage is not for divorce. It's for connection, lifelong, faithful, two people, that sort of thing. And that comes from Genesis. Now, if you were reading Genesis, you would note that that's a not quite correct quote from Jesus about Genesis. There is a word missing in Genesis, and this is the word, you already know it because I've circled it, I've highlighted it, is the word two. In Genesis it just says, hold fast to his wife and they shall become one flesh. Now what happened here was there needed to be an emphasis over time that what was meant by they is two, because polygamy in the Old Testament, you might say, why is there so much polygamy in the Old Testament? That is, polygamy is having more than one wife, many many wives. So eventually, which was seen as okay. And so even the Genesis reading was appropriate, because a man could marry someone and he'd become one with that person, and then he could marry a second wife and become one with that wife. So he was one with two or three or four. So the Genesis passage didn't really say no, to become one. It said to become one as many times as you want, really, if you were going to read it like that. And so later on in Israel's history, there was inserted this word two, and Jesus inserts it just to show that when he's talking about marriage, he's just talking about two people, and only two people, not one person and another, and that same person and another, and that same person, so that you can have three wives. Anyway, that's just a bit of background about that word two dropping in there, where it's not there in the Hebrew. Okay, so we will keep moving on. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, the Pharisees obviously were not happy with this, and they say to Jesus, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Now, this certificate of divorce, this goes back to that verse, doesn't it? And you can see it, the certificate of divorce. He writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. This certificate of divorce is a really important document. I imagine you've got a bunch of important documents at home, and let me try and give you a bit more there. I imagine you've got a bunch of important documents at home, and these documents you keep in a safe place. Well, what this passage is saying is the most important document for a woman who'd been divorced from her husband was a certificate of divorce. I've just given friends a certificate of marriage, which they loved. Certificate of divorce back then was very important. Certificate of divorce meant you could remarry. So here's a couple of things. In the Old Testament, we've got to see that there were 3 or 4 at least legitimate, valid reasons of being divorced. So those sorts of things. And secondly, it's to say that there was the expectation that there would be remarriage. Remarriage was not a problem. Remarriage was okay. And so that's the world that we're speaking into. And that's what we've got to keep in the back of our minds as we come up with this. So that certificate of divorce, my point is, was very important to the woman who had been divorced. If you've got any questions, put them in the live stream. So 1, I know you're there and somebody's listening. And 2, so if you do want me to stop on something, and if I've moved on, which I probably have by the time you've written your question, it's all right, I'll go back. Okay, so why was it that this command was given? And here's where we get into the sticky bit. He said to them, because of your hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So we want to remember that. From the beginning it was not so, but also because of the hardness of heart, it was a concession. So Moses gave it, and some people say, well, Moses gave divorce, not Moses gave divorce, not God. And well, this is not really the case. It's the law of Moses, but everybody knew it was the law of God. So what Moses was saying and writing was, as it was said, was the word of God. And so I want to say, yeah, it's God, therefore. Moses gave divorce as a way of getting legitimately out of a bad situation, which wasn't just sexual immorality, but included a number of other things as referenced in, for example, Exodus 21. So what we need to see here is that divorce that was valid meant remarriage was okay. Divorce, however, that was invalid meant remarriage was not okay. And that is where we're going to head right now. Verse 9, a big one. So I say to you, and I say to you, which is that idea of so I say to you, this is the implication of this. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Now what we need to see here is that this phrase, divorces his wife, we need to understand that the definition of that divorces his wife is the one that has been flagged right at the beginning. For any cause, for any and every cause. So you can say, Jesus is saying, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any cause, which is that sort of any and every cause, which is the school of Hillel, which is the debate about what Deuteronomy 24 meant about valid divorce. Jesus is saying for any and every cause is not valid. Now, as we know, except for sexual immorality in Deuteronomy 24, that is certainly 24, it says, yes, it does. It says, of course, that's in there, sexual immorality, that's a valid divorce. But any and every cause, the nakedness of a thing, just the thing, that is not a valid cause. Now, my computer is going around in circles, so I don't even know if that's working. So please just tell me, text me, or tell me if it's working. Anyway, I might have paused for a while there. Anyway, and what we need to see is this. Over time, people have taken this particular passage, verse 9, and literally divorced verse 9 from its context and read divorce the way we understand divorce today, whatever it might be, for whatever reason. And what that is an error of is not realizing that this was written to a particular people, and we need to understand what was going on back there and then. The great thing in this passage is we're told explicitly that the divorce that's being spoken about is a divorce for any and every reason. And Jesus is saying that is not a valid divorce. And if, therefore, your divorce is not valid, then you are not truly divorced. And if you marry another woman, that means you're committing adultery. Is there a message there? No, I'm going okay, I must be. You're committing adultery. So you can see that, can't you? I hope you can see it. Let me say it again. This verse is not a blanket, no remarriage except for sexual immorality, and no divorce except for immorality, and no remarriage. It's not saying that. It looks like it's saying that, but only when you divorce it from its context. When you keep it in its context, it can't be saying that. For example, let's go to 1 Corinthians. If it was saying that, if it was saying the one and only valid reason that a man can divorce his wife, sorry about that, it's cutting out intermittently. I really don't know what to do. I'm going to have to investigate this. Anyway, if it does this, it might be a signal problem, It might be. I've got some ideas. I'm going to try some different cables next week. If you believe that this verse is saying the only reason for divorce is sexual immorality here, well, first of all, you don't know the Old Testament. And second of all, you don't know the New Testament. Because when 1 Corinthians 7, Paul adds another reason a valid reason for divorce. In such case, I've got to remember that. Oh, that's good. Thank you, Greg. What I want to say is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says that a couple who has a believing wife and an unbelieving husband, if the husband doesn't want to stay because maybe the wife is believing, Paul will say that is grounds for divorce. That is grounds for separation. They don't have to. It's not that Christians and non-Christians can't be married. No, that they can be if one's become a... It's not wise to marry a non-Christian, but it's not wrong to be married to a non-Christian, if that makes sense. You might have become a Christian some stage along and you've already in your married life. But see, the thing is, if Paul is giving another reason, and so many evangelicals have said there are two reasons for divorce, immorality and abandonment, there's a problem there. Because what Paul is saying, therefore, to Jesus is, I know you said there's only one, but you're wrong. I'm going to add another one. That doesn't work, does it? You can't have Paul saying, Jesus, you're wrong. I'm going to add another reason. No, if that passage is saying that, then Paul is wrong. Paul is not listening to Jesus. Some people have said, well, abandonment and immorality could be the same thing. I think that's clutching at straws so much. It's not the same thing. It is the same effect, but it's not the same thing. And Paul is effectively saying there is another reason for divorce, which would be to contradict Jesus. That is why I think that type of thinking about this verse is so wrong. It's just wrong in context of the passage and in context of the Bible. This is saying divorce for any and every reason, as seen in Deuteronomy chapter 24, is not valid divorce. Sexual immorality in Deuteronomy 24 is, but not any and every reason. And so if your divorce is not valid for any and every reason, according to Deuteronomy 24, and you marry someone else, because your divorce is not valid, your marriage will be adultery. So I just want to say, and maybe say over and over, just because you are divorced and remarried, you can't read this verse as saying you are committing adultery. It just can't be saying that. And this is a really important point because so many people have been taught, because they've taken this as a proof text and they've stuck it on their foreheads there, someone comes to them who wants to be divorced, they then have to interrogate. Was it because of sexual immorality? That person says no. Well, therefore you can't divorce. And if you do divorce, you can't remarry. Bad advice. It's not godly advice. It's not Bible advice. It's not grace advice either. It's not very graceful. So that is a key passage there. And I want to say that we always need to read this in the light of what comes before and in the light of Deuteronomy 24. The discussion is about that. Well, how are we going? Oh, we're not doing too bad. I wonder if there's anything else I wanted to say. I wrote down a few things. Actually, to go back to 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, in such case as these, she is free and not bound. There's been extensive study on that phrase, in such case, or in such cases, and that is to say that this does not limit the cases to just one, abandonment, but there might be many cases. This is just one of many cases that might be a reason why a couple will need to move towards the God-given process of divorce, so to finish a bad thing so that they can get on with their lives. Maybe remarry, maybe not, whatever. But God has given divorce. It's his idea. It's his mercy for a broken world where sometimes marriages just don't work. And for us as Christians, we need to stop interrogating people or making people feel guilty and helping people and reminding them of forgiveness and the goodness of God. And all too often, people who have been divorced have either left the church or left the local church or still believe but just don't go to church because they've felt so excluded and unforgiven. My problem is divorce is not a sin. So you can't be forgiven of divorce because it's not a sin. You can be forgiven of... sin is the sexual immorality, and that you can be forgiven for if you ask for forgiveness. But divorce is not a sin. Divorce is just a process that God has given. Now, your divorce doesn't kill a marriage. Divorce buries a dead marriage. And that death has come by one of those things. not care or not providing food or not providing shelter or whatever it might be, as well as sexual immorality. Hope that makes some sense. It's important to see that. In our last moments, these last verses, I've got to admit, I don't know why they're there. And on Sunday, I didn't have a clue. Well, I had a clue. But since then, I've had a few more thoughts. And so I want to fly them by you and see what you think. So let's have a look. The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." So they're saying, if it's so hard to get out of it, if it can't be just for any and every reason, then better not to get into it. Now, that is a fascinating statement, because everybody would have said, no, the Genesis 2 command, a mandate for man and woman, is to be married. So the normal was to be married. You looked for a wife. You had kids, that sort of thing. The disciples are then now saying the shocking statement of it's better to not be married, which is going against Genesis 2. And you'd think Jesus would pull them up on that, but he doesn't. What he does is he says to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. So what he's saying is, yes, it is right to not be married. It is good to not be married. It could be something like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, that I wish you would all be as I am, that is, unmarried. And he talks about the present crisis, he talks about the time, that sort of thing. Jesus sort of does the same thing. Now he talks here about eunuchs. There's lots of eunuchs there. And I think he's using eunuchs as illustrations of people who are single for whatever reason. And one of the reasons is they have been so from birth. And there are those who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. I think this is what it's saying. Although in Genesis 2, the command to the age was to join and multiply, go forth and multiply, man and woman together, leave parents and go and be married and fill the earth and subdue it with children. I think he's saying here, but there is a new age ushering in the arrival of Jesus. So he is going to agree with the disciples who say it's better not to marry, but he's going to agree with them for a different reason than they have. It seems that they have a reason that it's too hard. If it's so hard to get out of, we're not going to get into it. Jesus is saying, actually, to not get into it, not because it's too hard, but to not get into it, that is marriage, is a good and right thing in this age. Because this age is the what? It's the age of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven in Matthew's Gospel appears 31 times, and of that 31 times, that 31 times is just a clear, massive amount compared to all the other books of the Bible and all the books of the New Testament, books of the Gospels. And here, the arrival of the kingdom of heaven, that's why all of our Matthew's Gospel has been called the kingdom something, the kingdom crisis or the kingdom attitude or whatever. And the kingdom attitude has ushered in now in such a way that surpasses the Genesis 2 command and says actually singleness can be good because singleness can be for the kingdom of heaven. And there are ways of being single. People can be single from birth. They can live for the kingdom of heaven. There are those who are single because they've been made that way, which I think could refer to a number of different ways of being made single. So if your husband or wife has died, you are now single again. Now that singleness is a valuable and precious thing that you have now to invest in the kingdom of God. It's not that you couldn't invest your marriage in the kingdom of God, but now that you are single, God has given you another gift, and that is that you're able to invest your life into the kingdom in all sorts of ways. It doesn't mean you can't get married. It just means if you're not married, there's nothing short about you. There's nothing lacking about you, that you can actually live a full and possibly fuller life for the kingdom of heaven than if you could if you were married. Interesting thing, isn't it? So those are the eunuchs. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. So there'll be some people who can't receive it, and I think possibly this is aligned with I'm getting messages. Or Van will sort it. Okay, I'm getting the one who is able to receive this should receive it. So if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul will say that it's better to be single for the kingdom, and he wants to save you from all the worries of marriage. He's not saying don't get married. He's just saying singleness can work. Well, there we are. We have done a lot of talking about divorce and remarriage. I suppose what I want to say in summary is in the Old Testament, you could divorce for a number of reasons. In the Old Testament, you could remarry and it not be adultery. The way that it would not be adultery is if your divorce was valid, and if it wasn't just for any and every reason, but was for either sexual immorality or one of those other care or those problems or abuse, that sort of thing. Jesus is saying the same in the New Testament, and so is Paul. There are a number of reasons for divorce. Sometimes a Christian marriage just doesn't work. And I want to keep saying the mantra, and that's not okay. No one thinks it's okay, but it's okay. Divorce happens, and that's not okay, but it's okay. So those four things, Jesus is saying exactly the same. He's not saying anything different. In this particular passage, he's addressing one type of divorce. It was the contentious issue at the time. It was the one that was promoted by Herodias and Herod Antipas in their marriage. That was unlawful because that was for any and every means from a lustful type of thing. Jesus is saying that one was unlawful. But not every divorce is unlawful. Okay. Well, we have come to an end, and I'm early. 2 minutes early. Wow. I thought we'd have far too much to say, and I think possibly because nobody really asked any questions. Hopefully that was because you were all listening and not because you just turned... The good thing about an online Bible study is you can put it on and walk out and go and make a copy and watch TV, and I would never know. I think you've been at Bible study all night. I think how good you are. Anyway, I think of you like that anyway. Well, see you next Wednesday night, and until then, God bless.